The message done. So, this is a unique opportunity to speak to you about a fantastic story in the Bible that I'm really privileged to be able to share with you. Now, I was going to write something up on the board there, so you're going to just bear with me while I write this up. I was going to do it beforehand, but here we go. Just as a teaser, this isn't Wordle. Just a 5-letter word just to hang out there for a moment. So we are continuing in our portraits from the Old Testament. You might not recognize anyone there, but hopefully in the stories that come you'll recognize the personas from the Bible. So we have gone through a few so far. Starting right in the creation story, we had 3 weeks in Genesis and had some great sermons and teaching there. And then we moved on to the story of Noah, where Bruce brought us a message on God's judgment on the earth when everyone was so wicked. Thank you, Johnson. And then we moved on to Abraham, and Murray brought us a message of hope about the God who keeps his promises. So moving through the Old Testament, we're just highlighting a couple of stories from way back, from the beginning of God's journey with the people of Israel and how he formed them as a nation. And we're just picking a few of the really fascinating and insightful stories that tell us more about God's plan for us. And I'm moving on tonight to something from that block outline there. So I'm talking a story from the book of Judges, well, from the time of the Judges. The book of Ruth belongs in that time period in the history of Israel. And because Catherine couldn't be here today, she had a conference, she was going to be talking about Joshua, but that'll happen next week. So we've got our timeline slightly crinkled, forgive us, but we're just in that block there, the partial kingdom of Exodus and the Promised Land, as the Jewish people move out of Exodus and captivity into the freedom of the place that God had planned and promised them. So if we were going through the Bible, by the time we get to the book of Judges, we're only this far into the Old Testament, if you want an idea of where we're headed. So we're just in the early stages of the history of Israel, and you won't need to look up your Bibles because I'm going to tell you the story of Ruth with the help of Bible Project in a moment. So the setting for today's story, the story of Ruth is set in about 1000 BC, so 1,000 years before Christ. It's an awful long time ago, about 3,000 years ago. And the story begins in the town of Bethlehem in Judah. So you can probably see the region of Judah. And that's where our characters were living and suffering and having a hard time. There's a farmer called Elimelech, we'll call him Mr. E for short, and he was having a tough time because there was a famine. He was married to a lady called Naomi, and because there was so little food to eat in his own country and his farm was failing, he decided to take his wife and his 2 young boys and head to the land called Moab, which is easy to spot, yes, in pink there. So they took probably a 10-day, maybe even longer with children, a 10-day journey to Moab where there was food to be had. And they lived there for 10 years. But eventually things went south there as well. Mr. E died and left Naomi a widow. And his 2 sons grew up and married ladies in the country of Moab, which was an evil nation. They did not worship the one true God. But his 2 sons married 2 lovely girls, Orpah and Ruth were their names. And so the 3 ladies were living together and the 2 sons-in-law, but those 2 boys died as well. So tragedy on tragedy, and we're left now with Naomi, the older widow, and her 2 daughters-in-law. And so we move into the story of Ruth, and now we'll see who the main characters of the actual story are. So there's Naomi, who I've introduced to you. She's the older lady, grief-stricken and a little bitter about what has been dealt to her in her life. And then her young daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite, not a Christian or a Jew by heritage, but a believer in God. She was faithful, energetic, enterprising, and hardworking. Quite an amazing young woman. And then the third main character in the story is a man called Boaz, who was probably middle-aged, probably had a bit of a tummy, but he was a good guy. He was a noble man, good character, God-fearing, a good employer, polite and courteous, probably a model citizen and someone with whom God was pleased. So those are 3 main characters, and now I'm going to sit down for a few minutes while we see. Oops, can she click the button? Yes. While we see the story told to us by the Bible Project, which I think does a great job. Oh, I need my tech band. I don't know where it is. Oh, okay. All right, here it comes. Great overview.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. There, the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they died too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi. And she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her, that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel, where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up, and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman in Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future. And that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz. And each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed. And that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story. And that's how little God is mentioned. Right, the characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story. And that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Wish I could take some credit for that. Wasn't that amazing? So those three main characters, as Bible Project outlined, are the human actors. But behind the scene, God's fingerprint is very evident. God's providence, God's love, this word I've written up on the board, God's hesed. Now, if you say it properly, I believe, as the Hebrews would, you'll get a sore throat or something like hesed. I don't know. We're going to stick with hesed, the nice anglicized version, which is kinder to us. But the fingerprint of God's work in that book is woven through the story. Although God isn't standing and proclaiming things or appearing before people, we can still see that he is at work. This word hesed is a big concept in the Old Testament. It's not just a once occasional thing. It actually appears 250 times in the Old Testament. It's that common. But it's not an easy word to translate. So through the Old Testament, we have various translations. Sometimes translators call it loving kindness, other times loyal love, steadfast love, unfailing love, covenantal love, or I'm committed to loving you, selfless sacrificial caring, and mercy. All those different words are adequate and legitimate translations of the Hebrew word hesed. And it's used to describe a human-to-human relationship or a God-to-human relationship. It's all about relationship. It's not something, an abstract concept away from relationship. There's an emotional quality to it, but it's fundamentally something we do or something God does. It's not just a thought or a feeling. So very rich in meaning, and because it's translated so many different ways, we often miss that as a strong concept. If we were reading the Old Testament in Hebrew, we would understand the hesed of God in a more real and powerful way. It's not a romantic love, it's not infatuation, it is faithful, reliable, and full of action. So one Bible scholar, Darrell Bock is his name, said, Hesed is one of the most fundamental characteristics of God. It's the positive attributes of God, all the positive attributes of God, his love, his covenant faithfulness, his mercy, grace, kindness, loyalty, in short, acts of devotion and loving kindness that go beyond the requirements of duty. So summing up that aspect of God and how he relates to us. So back to the book of Ruth. That word hesed is used 3 times in the speech of people in the book of Ruth, but as we've mentioned, it's also in the very fabric of the story. So here we have a look at some of the statements. Naomi says, when the daughters-in-law don't want to leave her and go back, she says to them, may the Lord show you hesed as you have shown to your dead and to me. So she uses the same word of God's action and love towards her. She says, may God do that for you. That's the first explicit use of the word. And then the second time that it's used again by Naomi, and this is when Ruth brings her the arms full of barley and perhaps roasted wheat as well from the lunch she had with Boaz. She says, he, that could be interpreted as Boaz or God. Commentators are divided on that. He's not stopped showing his hesed to the living and the dead. God and Boaz have been taking care of the living and the dead through that generous act of loving kindness. And the third instance, Boaz uses the word to describe Ruth's actions when she comes and proposes to him, which was breaking all the rules. She was taking such initiative and being so bold and daring to even suggest this, to creep up to where the man was sleeping at night on the threshing floor and uncover his feet, maybe so he'd get cold and wake up. She was doing all sorts of naughty, bold and daring things. And when he did wake up, boy, did she have an idea for him. So she was really stepping out of her comfort zone, of her cultural allowed zone and pattern of behavior, and taking it to him. But he saw it as her kindness, because she was reaching out and being vulnerable to look after her mother-in-law, so that her mother-in-law would be provided for. Because proposing that Boaz would marry her would mean that Naomi would have a place to belong. She would have land that she would belong on. And if Ruth had a child in time, that would be a grandson or a granddaughter for her. And that happened, as you see in the story. The little baby Obed that was born, Naomi was the grandmother. And what a wonderful thing, because she could tell this little grandson who God was. How the God who she thought was bitter was actually the God of Hesed, the God of love and faithfulness. And Obed would grow up and he would have a boy, and his name would be Jesse. And then he would grow up and have a boy called David. So the same stories that grandmother told her little grandson got passed on through the generations till they came to David, who wrote all the Psalms about God's loving faithfulness. And you can go to several Psalms and find the concept of Hesed in them. We'll come to one of them in a minute. God's Hesed to us is, as I mentioned, 250 times explicitly spoken of in the Old Testament, but God says it of himself as well. In Exodus, when Moses is telling God on the mount, show yourself to me, God can't do that. He would be overpoweringly awesome. It wouldn't be something that Moses could be. So God hides himself and passes by, and he says to Moses, I am the Lord who is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And the words abounding in love and faithfulness and maintaining love are the Hebrew words hesed, repeated in verse 6 and 7 right after each other there. So God says that of himself right in the beginning as he begins to reveal his nature to form the people of Israel. This is who I am. And then just another passage. I won't have time to do all 250 tonight, but one other one. Whoops. Psalm 136, which was probably written by David, says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. And every verse, the rejoinder or the reply is, his faithful love endures forever. Okay. Chocolate, if you can tell me what faithful love is in Hebrew? Hesed. You got it. That same concept, he is the faithful God and his love is unending. So it's a long psalm, I think 25 verses, and every single verse the people respond, his love endures forever. Isn't that awesome? So God shows us Hesed, but we are called to show that to other people. I don't know what I do wrong with technology. Okay, Old Testament, Micah chapter 6. This is what the Lord requires of you, to do what is right, to love mercy, guess the word that is? Hesed, and to walk humbly with your God. And then from the New Testament, 1 John, this is real love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as a sacrifice to take away our sins. Dear friends, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love one another. And it's not Hebrew, so the Greek word there is sort of an equivalent about how we express that kind of love to others, but the concept is the same. Having received this unfailing, constant love from God, we are to show it to others. So I've had opportunity in recent times to consider this in my own life. Some of you have been knowing and journeying with me through our particular family situation. My mom and sister's situation has been ongoing for about 4 years and been quite exasperating at times because of serious mental health issues and relationship breakdown. And I've been all sorts of places in my own heart and mind with that. But this week I was finally legally given the power and the duty to make decisions for my mom's well-being. And this has huge implications for my sister who's lived with her. So I've been forced to consider this concept of loving kindness. What does loving kindness look like now that my sister and mother are both so vulnerable? What do they see the world as, and how can I help them from this new position I have? How can I act in their best interests? How can I help them when they don't know what's real and what's imagined? When they don't understand how things work? If I am carrying my hurt from the past and thinking about, now I'm going to show you what it's like to be falsely accused, or whatever my anger is going to boil over to and preach up from the past, I'm called upon to show Hesed, to be patient, to offer selfless caring, to respond with kindness, to do what is in their best interests. It's not about me trying to put my finger on the scale and right the things that I felt were done wrong to me, but I'm called upon to be an ambassador and an evidence of God's grace and goodness for them. We've got time to do something on the whiteboard, haven't we? So, I used to be a language teacher, and this was in the days before any technology. I'm sorry, I'm off camera, Howard. We had overhead transparency, so I got really good with, pens and things like that. So I often resort to writing live things. So if God shows us his loving kindness, his unfailing faithfulness, he's showing that to me and you, as that verse in Exodus said, I am the God of compassion and mercy, slow to anger, filled with unfailing love and kindness. It's not meant to end with us. It's not just loving us so that we can feel loved, but that we are to look to those around us who need to see and feel God's love. And we are to show that same love that we have received from God because he loved us, because he first loved us, we are to love others. So we're not the only way they can feel God's love, but we are meant to be conduits of God's love as it comes through us. Want to hear a fun fact? This verse here where God says, I'm compassionate and merciful and slow to anger. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I just stumbled upon this. It literally is God has a long nose. And actually it's plural, God has long noses or long nostrils. I thought that is so fascinating. Doing a bit more reading and digging, a short-nosed person would be quick to anger. They would burn easily with anger. They would quickly lose their temper and flip out and respond in rage. So that's a short-nosed person in Hebrew culture. Long-nosed person, Yes, they won't breathe fire and smoke in a hurry. God says, I am slow to anger. In fact, anger is not his strong characteristic. Anger is a reaction to sin. He isn't an angry God. He is a compassionate, slow to anger God, full of mercy and grace. So, yeah, God's got a long nose. I bet you didn't know. She hasn't lost her clicker. No, she's good. So some of you may know that we have a dog, and it's a mixed blessing, let me tell you, because at 7 o'clock in the morning he's awake and he needs a walk every single morning. I don't know why he doesn't get tired of it, but off we go to Moya Park, and it's so good for my soul and my souls and my general well-being, because while we're there, I just get to see the new light of every day. And it reminds me of this verse, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Did you sing this recently? His mercies are new every morning. Every single day, God is renewing his mercies to us. Our problems may be old and tiresome. You may have a situation like I did that drags on for 4 years, and you go, God, when will this end? I don't know how I'm going to cope. I don't have a solution. I feel stuck. God's mercy is new every day, and his grace for you is new every day. Your problems may be wearing you thin, or you may face a fresh new challenge when you wake up tomorrow, but God's mercy is fresh every morning. And I invite you to take time in the mornings to go out and look at the sky and just say, thank you, Lord, for today's mercies, because you're going to give me what I need for today. It may be hard, and I might not feel up to it, but you have what I need for me to cope. I'm going to just flick onto our last slide now, and that's going to be, oh, so easy to do, there we go, to discuss at our tables. So we may know about God's mercy, God's hesed, his loving kindness, but what can keep us from experiencing that? Okay, that's going to be your head-scratching question to have a chat about at your table. So if you're very few people at your tables, feel free to stand up and mix and mingle and have a bigger number, but as you feel comfortable, whatever you feel comfortable with. We'll have about 10 minutes or so to talk about this.